Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to today's episode of the New Books Network. I am your host, Nomeh Anthony Kanayo, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Rita Kiki Edozie, the former Deva Patrick Endowed Chair of Political, Economic, and Social Innovation and Professor of Global Governance at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Dr. Edozie is an accomplished scholar and author of several influential books and academic articles on global development, democratization, African affairs, and race and identity. Today, we'll be discussing her co-authored book with Dr. Moses Khisa titled Africa's New Global Politics, Regionalism in International Relations, published by Line Reiner Publishers in 2022 and rated highly recommended reading by Choice Magazine. Professor Edozie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Hi, Nomeh Kanayo.
Thank you.
Very glad to be here.
Thank you, ma'am. So, Africa is no longer a passive or peripheral player in international relations. Instead, through the African Union and other regional mechanisms, African states are constructing new norms, asserting collective sovereignty, challenging global inequalities, and contributing to reshaping of global governance. Prof, what inspired the book and the bold arguments you make in it?
Well, look, I think, I've been teaching international relations, and I feel as if I've been teaching it forever, but really since 2001 in various iterations at various universities. Um, one thing I noticed was that Africa is not represented much in the literature that I teach, on the one hand. And when it is, it's narrated, through very liberal perspective, liberal international perspective, where Africa is sort of governed by, international multilateralism, or on the opposite side, it is seen as, through a sort of neo-Marxist, global inequality, perspective where, Africa is seen as a subject to, a victim really, in many respects, to the rest of the world. And, it's just sort of a lot of, theories about how Africans, are sort of disrupted in an international system and, an international system where they are invisible and, have no play. Right, and so, I observed, the activities and practices of the African Union, now since about 2005, myself, sort of observing, the restructuring of the African Union from the Organization of African Unity and, the gradual rise of the African Union, as a result around, policy issues, global policy issues and impact. And so I felt in a previous book that I wanted to write about the African Union, and I did. That book was called The African Union's Africa. But, subsequent to that, I felt that, a story that I didn't tell in that book was how the African Union was reshaping and international relations of Africa. And that's how I sort of came to the core thesis of this current book, which was to tell Africa's story as a global actor, with all its challenges and opportunities.
Okay, thank you. So, what is driving this shift? What is driving the shift towards Africa as an international actor
Yeah,
or active player?
yeah. Um, so the shift is gradual, but the shift occurred and around the beginning of the millennium, where, African states under the Organization of African Unity um, realized that, they were in a post-apartheid moment. They were also in a moment of globalization, right? And what was the effect of that? On the one hand, there was a celebration of, the Organization of African Unity feeling that it has accomplished its foremost goal, which is to decolonize, the continent, manifest in, the final South African struggle against apartheid. So, what's new for the OAU? But on the other hand, it was also an era of globalization, a new world order that, raised a lot of uncertainty for Africa, especially. It was a time, especially in the 1990s through the early millennium, where, civil wars in Africa were really, sort of disrupting, the continent. And the international order, so to speak, were throwing out, sort of concepts of recolonizing Africa. I mean, they didn't use those words. They would say things like, Africa needs to come under trusteeship. There was a sort of liberal imperialism, that was coming out of liberal, institutions. The ICC, for example, was founded for Africa to, solve African conflicts and, settle, African dictatorships. So Africans reacted, African states reacted. They felt, what, we, need to, go back to some of the ideals of, Pan-Africanism under Kwame Nkrumah and retake, the continent back to ourselves. We need to restructure the Organization of African Unity, which is a regionalism of, continental integration. But we need to strengthen that, but we also need to, stand for and support and protect African sovereignty, African continental sovereignty. We need to also, dismantle, the continent away from Western hegemony and dependence. We need to, as Kwame Nkrumah, said, we need to police ourselves. We need to, and that was, some of the goals of the restructuring of the African Union into the African Union back in around, the 2001, 2002. It became, sort of established, that we are going to restructure, this organization to defend African sovereignty, to also pool, African state resources and foreign policies, to engage global issues as one. That's another big thing, realization that the world, didn't treat African states individually. They treated it, as a single structure. But, when they wanted to engage it individually, it would be to, engage small African states, and barely to, sort of just recolonize them, have their way with them. And so African states knew that, and they knew that it was important for them to see strength through shared values, shared fates, and shared solidarity. And that was one of the biggest, reasons why the African Union was restructured and therefore founded. And that shift, I mean, on the one hand, the African Union has done quite well in embodying, that role of, spokesperson for the continent in sort of global issues. They've evolved a structure, I think, a structure, an institutional structure, and a leadership structure that has done pretty well in, becoming more visible as a global actor in the world. And I sort of traced that through the millennium, observed it, and felt that I wanted to write about it in this book, to assess its impact and, look at its challenges and opportunities.
Thank you so much. So, but most of the resistance that also brought about new norm restructuring in transnational justice, which you discussed as some of the contributions of Africa to international relations. You unpack a lot of it in the later chapters of the book, starting from chapter 4, I think, down to chapter 7. But before we go there, because I have some questions reserved where you will talk about it more deeply from the perspective of Africa's contribution to IR. But some of the concepts you introduce at the beginning of this book, you describe Africa's engagement as regional internationalism, and in a way, you talked about it as something that is dual movement. Can you help us understand these concepts?
Yeah. I mean, in for me, even, writing a book about international relations from the perspective of regionalism was pretty eye-opening. And I really want to give credit to a scholar that I had been reading at the time that I felt helped me, frame my own concept of regionalism, not just as regionalism, but regional internationalism. And so her concept, and this is Caroline Postel-Vinay, and she wrote a book in 2007 on the world region, concept of the world region. And she discussed many, sort of world regions in international relations, history, including, Africa as a world region. And, for much of the developing world, but especially Africa, she wrote that Africa as a world region was a region that international orders imposed their will. And she went back to, the transatlantic slavery region, Pax Britannica, and sort of colonialism, world colonialism, how, um, these international orders impose their will, on, Africa as a region, right? She goes into post-World War One, World War Two, Pax Americana, and she really details and describes how these international orders, impose their will and impacted, these regions, in the global south, but especially, Africa as a world region was the most impacted and the most imposed, as a regional world. And so what I do is acknowledge that, certainly, but in a post-colonial era, with the formation of the Organization African Unity, but especially with the restructuring and the emergence of the African Union, it's Africa's, effort and attempt to restructure that narrative, not just the narrative, but the reality of Africa being a world region that is impacted rather than is a participant and an agent of contribution, right? And so the African Union states realize this, and that is why, they're all willing, 55 or 54, African states membership, that's universal membership. No other continent or region has that, but they all realize that, they need to, pull their, resources together as a region, to impact the world. And so the Organization of African Unity was more so focused on regional integration, on continental integration. It was a kind of governance regionalism or, a multilateralism that hoped to forge, a united, continental region. But the African Union regionalism forged in an era of globalization and, at the same time, deglobalization, was a region that felt that it would pool, African states together to embark upon global engagement. And it says so in its constitutive act that this will be an organization that will protect, African sovereignty, that will, dismantle, dependency on former colonial powers, that will enhance, African autonomy in a global world. So regional internationalism reflects that kind of regionalism. And why I call it dialectical or contradictory is that in the millennium, through the millennium, we're talking about open globalization, and globalization meant that countries would open, their markets away from national, boundaries to global boundaries, right? But regionalism sort of, even like the European Union regionalism, as well, but regionalism says no, globalization has a negative impact, and so we're going to forge, regional boundaries. So the African Union, wants to forge these regional boundaries and is still very much, focused on regional integration, but they're also, focused on using the African Union as a way to interact and embrace, their position in a global world and participate in globalization as well, but through the African region as opposed to these 54 separate states.
Okay, two questions. One, would you regard African Union as reflecting the visions of Kwame Nkrumah in his visions of a united Africa? Would you think that everything they are doing now, fostering African international relation, reflects that vision?
No, because as you know, Kwame Nkrumah back in 1963 wanted the erasure of national borders and Africa to forge as a single country, with no national borders, but in a federated, kind of state. And in 1963, he didn't get that vision, and so I was quite disappointed that he didn't get that vision. But what he did get, at least, was the compromise, which was, the beginnings of the African states forging together in, at the time, a sort of loose, regional formation where they would begin to gradually, converge, institutions, build institutions that were regional, and then by the restructuring into the African Union. It gets closer to that vision. Maybe in Agenda 2063, Kwame Nkrumah's vision is reflected in that document. Maybe by 2063, that vision will be a reality. I doubt it. I doubt it. And so clearly, the vision of African unity, under a sort of single political, agenda, is far from realized. So I think that Kwame Nkrumah would be disappointed. But, he may also be satisfied with progress and aspirations. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Because I've been wondering, there was a lot of mentioning of Kwame Nkrumah going back to his dreams, his visions, and I was, oh, probably we're headed towards that direction. And yeah. So collectivism is in a way at the heart of this new approach to international relations. But while I was reading the book, I was also thinking about how the uniqueness of this approach to international relations. And reading about it, I had other regions in mind who, like ASEAN, Southeast Asian, in that region, where because of a rising China, because of the geopolitical tensions in that region, these institutions are also putting up that collective approach to their external diplomacy. So I was trying to understand how unique this approach is to Africa and the African Union.
Well, each region will have its own, context, and therefore differences, although similarities as well. And, we often use the European Union as a yardstick to compare, sort of understanding and some research on the African Union, especially in terms of its institutional development, and its impact. And so, of course, the African Union is not unique. Now there are several, regional organizations. However, I do think that the African Union can be seen as a model and a distinctive approach in several ways. One, as I said, the African Union isn't, sort of be held by any sort of super state. All 54 African countries, of course, they're diverse. Some are more advanced than others. Some are democratic, some are not. But they do come together. Around their own sort of initial racial identity. Talked about the reason why I used constructivism in IR as opposed to any of the others is because, of the nuance, or the cultural and social, infusion of, political behavior, that constructivism gives us, right? And so what motivates, African states to come together in the first place so universally, that the entire continent, including North Africa, which, could be considered Arab Africa, why do they all come together? It is, this sort of racial identity against, colonization and the Western scramble, right? And the marginality, of that identity in the world. They come together to, face that and oppose that, right? And so the fact that, this regional organization African countries, all African countries are members, is unique compared to ASEAN and the European, even the European Union, right? That's one. The other is what the African Union has been able to do, which is to move beyond just the common market. I mean, some say, that's maybe its fault, focus on the common market and then, the political security relations will come later. But Africa didn't have that that advantage, to only focus on economic integration. Especially, as I said, in the 90s millennia, where, civil wars broke out, across the continent in, really sort of disruptive ways. And so, the continent had to say to itself, we need to create mechanisms that will, help us to intervene in conflict resolution and in democracy building, right? And in, securing, one nation at the behest of the other, right? And so we need to intervene in, a lot of the, violence, erupting in the continent. And so they built, these mechanisms, one being the non indifference policy.
Yeah.
So the Organization of African Unity had a non-interference policy, which is very similar to the United Nations, right? Which is, states have sovereignty. And so unless a state is attacking another state, we don't get involved. If it's about really the domestic, relations of the state, if it's a civil war, we don't get involved. We have a neutral policy. They changed that, and they said, you know what, we cannot be indifferent. In fact, the United Nations first floated the R2P, but it was a policy or normative framework, which is that United Nations will move away from non-interference, but we will interfere when leadership or government is threatening, its peoples, through genocide or through, ethnocide or any sort of human rights onslaughts on its own peoples. That is responsibility to protect. A government has a responsibility to protect, and we will intervene, but they never did because, administrations could never ratify that, right? African Union ratified it and put it in its constitutive act. And so it said, we will protect African peoples under assault of human rights or genocide by intervening. And so that meant that the African Union had to build, institutions, military institutions. And it did, it's standby force, it's peacekeeping forces, and so there's a lot of criticism against the union for not implementing that policy fairly, across the board. A lot of missed cases, but it has used that policy to intervene in Somalia, Mali.
Yeah, but just to follow up with the non-interference and also the shift to non-indifference by the AU. You discuss it, and I understand it as a contribution of Africa to international security discourse. But in the book, you highlighted AU's commitment to these sort of norms initiative that it has initiated And you gave examples of Comoros. It's in AU's intervention in Comoros in 2008, sorry, 2008. But in light of the development that has happened after you wrote this book, talking about the coup in Mali, Niger, Gabon, and Gabon, I think Gabon is especially of interest to me because one of the in AU's constitutive act, there was a clause that said prohibition of auto-legitimation by individuals or group that seize power through unconstitutional changes of government only to turn around and participate in elections organized under their control. I mean, in Gabon, we see a situation where a coup leader comes in, organize an election, and win again. How committed is AU to its non-indifferent initiative or norm?
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, in a new research that I'm doing, and this research is on ECOWAS, not the AU, but I'm looking at, the same sort of challenge, conceptual challenge, for regional organizations like the AU, ECOWAS, as well, which is there's a complex contradiction, that you've got these laws that nation states abide by. I mean, the UN has this problem as well, right? Nation states abide by these treaties, they ratify them, they agree to them, and then they break them, and then what's going to be the enforcement capacity? I should remind you that the UN does not have a policy to suspend its members if they're not democracies. It does not have that, right? That is why the three sort of breakaway states from ECOWAS, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, they're still members of the African Union and they're still members of the UN, but they were suspended from the ECOWAS and finally have exited, ECOWAS, because of the AU policy, really, of, unconstitutional changes in government being, against the Constitutive Act, and they embark upon a number of enforcement mechanisms and punishments, for members that do, including diplomatic relations, the sanctions, suspension, military intervention, so there's a range of, tools and mechanisms that they can use, right? And so, I think the African Union has also interfered, strategically, sometimes, I think, perhaps they have not been able to agree on the severe measures. What they're trying to balance is regional integration or continental integration and the, evolving of their institutional mandate, right? But not lose members, at the same time, right? So the African Union at least says we see unconstitutional changes in government as military coups. That's our, sort of, we draw the line. The Comoros case, the Gabonese case, they're all sort of, there's sort of some nuances, in the way those things occurred. I think what the African Union says is we want to see the aspirations, even where there are coups, there are unconstitutional changes. When the, new coup leader comes in, we want the commitment from that military government that this is transitional and that within a, time period, they will be transitioning back to civilian rule and they want our help, in order to do that, right? And so they want to see those kinds of commitments, and that's what they saw in the Comoros case, in the Gabonese case, more recently in some of the coups in Mali and Niger. That's what they want to see. Now, critics of the union will say it's hypocritical, and so, somewhat it is. But where do you go when you have countries that have where coups have been, instituted, and the peoples there want those governments over the civilian governments, right? And so there's a balancing act, right? And I just think that that's what the union tries to balance, sometimes well, sometimes not as well as it could, but I think it wants to focus on the really, aggressive, cases of militarization in the continent, Somalia, Eastern Congo, now Sudan, I mean, this is where they really want to focus on, eradicating, conflict and conflict resolution. And, maybe they do 50%. Right, and I want to say that 50%, NATO, and especially the US, sort of ran Afghanistan, for how many years? Since 2001, and just couldn't achieve its goals there, So regional security provision, is complex, and it will be complex for Africans as well.
Okay, this is really interesting because balancing between this common African position and the different interests these African states have, and their own the perceptions of the leaders on how to handle issues are quite complex. I was thinking about it all through while reading this book. I was thinking about ECOWAS, how some countries wanted to go ahead with military intervention as a result of the coup, and how some say no, we are not in, we can't intervene militarily in this. And while I was reading this book again, I was seeing common African position, and I was, how can this be balanced? How can these common positions be balanced? And actually had a question about the implementation within, because common African position is successful when Africans are interacting with non-continental actors, but within themselves, how committed, although you already, talked about that.
Yeah, but I think it's a great question. It's a compelling question. Um, and by and large, Africans have been pretty united on these common African policy. That's all they are. They're, global public policy standpoints. They originated with before even sort of the African Union, but with the prowess, I would say, of African multilateralism at the UN. The Africa bloc at the UN, Africa having the most countries in a single region, and the Africans at the UN noting, that fact and getting together to say, you know what, we are going to engage, global UN issues, from a single position, right? Most of the issues affect us anyway, right? Affect us together. I mean, if it's not a common policy position on the environment, on trade, on on women and gender, these are positions that Africans, agree on. And look at how these common African positions, like, the Africa Bloc, and at the World Trade Organization, right, has forged to become so momentous that it's the Africa Bloc that sort of represents the, alternative, trade routes, policies that the global South is pushing, at the World Trade Organization. There's the Africa Bloc that sort of, really sort of pushed these, trade policies that impacted Africa and the global South negatively, that the World Trade Organization wanted to, predominate. And the African group said, no, this is the African common policy position on this. And, they've been able to stalemate at least, the World Trade Organization negotiations on that point. But, with great outcomes. Now, the African group was seen as, so sort of powerful that the African Union gets to be a regional organization member of the EU, right? I'm not the EU, I'm sorry, of the G20, of the G20, right? That's progress. The same with the African Union's, the Africa bloc's position on UN reform. This was through a common African policy position, back in, around 2017, the Ezulwini, Ezulwini was even before that, right? And the African policy position sort of expanded into a mandate for UN reform. And at least on the table in 2025 is that Africa should get, when an American president actually, supported that, at least it was, Biden, supported that at the UN, that Africa should get, 2 permanent seats, at the United Nations Security Council.
Non-voting.
Well, of course, and to show you that the African policy positions, so sort of powerful in terms of uniting, Africans, that on the one hand, this last speech by Burkinabe, foreign minister, at the UN, on the one hand, berated ECOWAS for, trying to restrict, its, Burkina and other ASS states, sort of membership and activism at the UN, berated, but also, stood tall and said, well, grateful for, your permanent membership. However, that's not enough. We need the veto power like other member states, and that's a crime, for you at the UN to deny us, as Africans, of that. So the policy positions, are clear and remain resilient, among, Africans. However, what I can talk about later, if you want, is where is this crumble with the protocol on democracy and good governance? This is where, states have not been able to abide by this. It's a complex issue. I wish people who look criticizing sort of Africa and the African Union would understand the complexity of it, of the fragility of, democracy in Africa. But at the same time, there are many African states that have been successful, or, at advancing democracy. But, there are some African states that are landlocked, that are, overrun by, sort of terrorism and, all sorts of militancies, diseconomies, that democracy has not been able to offer anything in terms of advancing, those societies. And so we've got to recognize the reality of that as well. And the African Union does. has to recognize the complexity of that and how, and I think it does, recognize the complexity and how, democracy is a gradual, sort of aspiration. And as long as countries are aspiring to it, genuinely, that's where they draw the line.
Okay. So, just in continuing with this common African position, chapter 6 of the book discussed Pan-African global economy, and you talk about African Continental Free Trade Agreement and argue that Africa is leveraging regional integration to renegotiate its position in global economy and build economic sovereignty. So, how do we understand these as African contribution to the field of political economy?
Yeah. So again, using the constructivist, dimension of the framework that I use to narrate this African story of internationalism, even in the African political economy, that's what I do in that chapter as well. So, for example, I use the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and I view it through what I call diplomatic regionalism. I think I called it international diplomacy, but the African Union actually using that agreement. So in that chapter, I don't talk much about the actual political economy of Africa, right? I talk about how the African Union is using the African Continental Free Trade Area as a mechanism to negotiate, global economic, relations with the rest of the world, right? And so why this is important is because, this is really the crux of, the African problem, really. It's the economy. It's Africa is underdeveloped, in terms of the economy. Yet we always, throw out the statistics that in terms of income, Africa is not income, I'm sorry, in terms of mineral resources, Africa is the wealthiest continent in the world. It has the most mineral resource deposits in the world, yet it is income poor, right? So there's a mismatch between Africans being able to, generate and manage and produce their economic resources, and trade them with the world for the benefit of wealth in Africa. We have not been able to do that. And the African Union is very much aware of that. They're very much aware of that. They've been aware of that since the Organization of African Unity. They've had several, summits and treaties, and commitments and initiatives, to advance what they call the, African economic continental agenda. And yet this is their greatest challenge as well, because if it were as simple as, all African countries, forming an economic region where they trade with each other and, produce wealth, they would have done that, But, these 54, 55 separate African countries are divided by nations, national economies, and the diversity of the national economies, some being, pretty resourceful economies, others, not being. They're also divided by their colonial or the former colonial, construct. And neocolonialism is real in the fact that, these economies have been structured into the global economy through, colonialism, right? I mean, the embodiment of neocolonialism is most in French Africa, right? Francophone Africa, where, those structures are very visible. The CFA currency, the ACF, so all of these structures are real, that the African Union also has to, sort of engage, and also the dominance of, global economies like the US economy. There's a superpower, economies that dominate, the global order. The EU for Africa is also, so how does the African Union sort of, engage these, and then becomes China, comes China, in the more recent, which, has also sort of taken over from the former colonial powers in terms of the revenue generation in economic transactions with Africa. And so what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement does, of course, it's a blueprint for how Africans will, sort of increase trade, regionalize also their economies, but it's more so a tool, for Africans to say, we're going to negotiate with all these entities that I just mentioned, that the terms of trade will be negotiated through, this agreement, right? And that Africa's way of engaging with the global economy will be a shared one, a united one, right? But it will be one on our terms. On we will go into agreements that benefit us Africans and are not, asymmetrical in terms of, benefiting others. Now, again, it's an aspiration, but it's also an aspiration that has institutions, it has organs, it has policies that Africans are talking about every day. That's why you have an institutional platform. So I don't want to minimize it. That that the talking shop is the reality of politics in 2025, and so it's important. And that is what I think the value of that chapter is, share of their, diseconomy in the world, but are doing things to, as much as possible, combat that. I mean, I hope that the African Union can float that currency. They're talking about a single currency. And I know that since Gaddafi was killed off, people think, oh, it's dead. It's not, they talk about it all the time about, they call it the Afro, they're calling it Afro or the Afri or something, but there are talks about it, negotiations about it, and that's what I think is the power of that chapter.
Okay, thank you so much. You advanced the point about AU's strategy in pursuing this agenda of beneficial trade agreement or economic arrangements between Africa and the external actors. You said the AU's strategy is aid for trade. Can you help us understand why and how this initiative differs from what we have currently? Because you highlighted also about how there is need to promote this concerted African position or common African position while negotiating. But you also highlighted whether on the part of the Western partners in China, how these institutions prefer bilateral trade agreements. And so I would help us
Well, I
understand.
hope in that chapter, excuse me, I was highlighting the aid for trade as one of many initiatives that the AU was using to achieve economic self-sufficiency. But that intervention with the aid versus trade is really sort of leveraging, you know, maybe it was Dan Bisamoya's book, you know, on, I hope you've read it, Dead Aid, you know, but it come to, you know, around 2008, 2009, where there was, you know, a big debate on, you know, um, Africans moving away from aid, you know, in terms of their bilateral, you know, relations with the especially international organizations and global superpower actors, but moving away from that and moving into, if at all, you know, the international actors were going to partner, you know, with Africans around developments, you know, then let it be trade, you know, on trade. And so here's the starting point. The starting point is that trade dependency, or we won't call it trade, uh, unfair terms of trade. That's what Pablo Prebisch, you know, talked about back in the unfair terms of trade, you know, are just so, you know, visible, you know, in Africa's trade relations with the rest of the world. You know, the unfair terms of trade, right? You know, so if you want to help us, you know, let us talk about, you know, how to make trade more fair for Africans. Okay, that's what we mean by aid for trade. You know, that we don't want the aid. We want to be able to, you know, trade, you know, with you on more equal terms, which would be that we would, you know, receive more equal revenues, you know, from our trading relationships. So we would disembark upon these you know, neo-colonial trading relationships, you know, and there are many. And how can we also, maybe you can help us, you know, because the West always says, well, we would, you know, import more of your products, but, you know, Western standards, you know, are this high and you don't meet them, right? You know, so if you want to then partner with us around development, let's, you know, find ways to help our producers, you know, meet your standards, right? You know, so that's, you know, moving away from aid, you know, to trade facilitation help, right? You know, providing resources to help us, you know, boost our trade, right? You know, that's what, you know, I was referring to, and that's what the African Union is doing as one measure, right? You know, it's a measure of want to move away from aid, want to, you know, support with, you know, helping us boost our trade with especially, you know, sophisticated markets in the US and the EU. And that's sort of what the programs do. And of course, you know, I think that, you know, for places like the EU and maybe or even the development industry, what used to be the development industry in the US, you know, that would be what they would want to do, you know, that they would be fixated on, you know, that policy, right? You know, trade facilitation, you know, because they have an inclination to under liberalism, you know, want to, you know, support, you know, African development, and that's okay, right? That's certainly not the only thing that the African Union is doing around, you know, achieving economic self-sufficiency. Okay. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. A follow-up question would be how also these will differ from dependency in the sense it's usually framed in the terms of help, whereby the West, I don't want to say external Western actors anymore because China also has these tendencies as well, whereby they help us develop, they help Africa develop its for example,
Capacity,
its
capacity.
capacity, and Africa sells to them. Can't Africa develop its own capacity, like develop fund its development? What restricts it? This is just off the book thought, because a lot of conversations about Africa seems to be rhetorical, and even though you consider it important as it's ongoing, there's usually this shift or away from rhetorics and practicality. So what is
Yeah.
preventing Africa from developing its own capacity and then interacting with external actors on equal term of exchange?
Yeah. Well, look, going back to how I began, with your question about, regional internationalism and, my response about the Africa as a world region. I mean, these things are so complex. Africa has been the most, multilateralized, hybridized, and there are challenges to that. We're seen as, oh, you know, everybody helps us, but what do we do? But another way of looking at that is Africa is a very complex, continent. I mean, in some respects, if you compare us to the Middle East, hybridization and sort of multilateralism, has been good for us, right? And so, yeah, but I don't want to say, I've debated this as well, even in my teachings, when I'm teaching to young, Americans who are, sort of really into decolonization and, Africa first and all that, it's a nice idealism, and then, there's the reality of, sort of, the everyday and the who we are. I mean, my brother, I think a Nigerian, right? I
Yes.
am as well. We speak English organically as a first language and a multiple language, right?
Yes.
And sort of our sensibilities, are shaped in our identities as, you know, um, Nigerians of the world, right? And so, think about that in each of these national countries as well. You're going to have liberals, you're going to have conservatives, you're going to have, culturalists and sort of Pan-Africanists, seeing all things differently, right? And all those things are contended ideas in Africa as well. And so the question of, I think we should continue to um, um, propose, partnerships from, the Western world. I mean, most of the capital, resources is in the West, currently, and so if we want some of our initiatives funded, the reality is that we're going to have to learn how to, you know, um, engage that and access, those resources. But what the African Union, I think, does differently now is that it's not going to be a patronizing relationship. We realize, that we're on the go now. We're different. I mean, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the leader there, Tshisekedi, you know, I mean, I want us not to criticize African leaders for every little, they're not perfect. But what he's recognized is that his country sits on, some of the world's most needed resources, right? And, he's navigating a world using the African Union, using the US, the EU, France, um, Belgium, all of the actors in order to achieve, fair production of coltan or, these gold or these other diamonds, in that region, fair production, knowing that it's an economy that doesn't have a lot of capacity, right? Fair production, and also, in a way that febs off, you know, these militants coming from another country, right? He has to, you know, um, as sophisticatedly as he can, you know, navigate all that in order to, achieve, prosperity for Congolese. And I think his intentions are there. It's quite clear that his intentions are there. Um, but what the African Union tries to do is provide an institutional framework for supporting those attentions. So providing institutional cover, even if the Angola mediation did not work, that's the reality of, global actors beyond our power, right? But we were able to, through that negotiation, uh, institute ourselves as an African Union into the negotiations and the peace talks to ensure that, Congolese sovereignty is met, Congolese economic demands are met, in a partnered way. And I think that is the complexity of African internationalism in its own, and that's the story I wanted to, show you in the African Union as well. Um,
Thank you. So let's talk a little more about transnational justice. This is one area you also highlighted Africa's contribution, and you talk about it in the light of contestations and development of new courts, um, new ways of practicing justice. Can you help us just highlight this, what we can regard as contribution in
yeah.
Africa's
Another, in the first place, in teaching international relations myself, I'm just sort of, and with the transitional and transnational justice becoming sort of big, huge theme of international relations, especially since the establishment of the ICC. But, nobody really talks about much anymore, as much as we used to, the foundational model of transnational justice that came from Africa. And that's South Africa, and that's the transitional, what was it called? The TLC, Restorative Justice, Commission, presided over by Nelson Mandela, really, in his, model of, he got the Peace Prize for this, who say, look, I was a militant organization, but, and yes, for, just cause, sort of militancy, but we know when to pull up the arms and, come together to produce negotiated, nonviolent agreement and compromise solution for the country's conflict. And then, in terms of post-conflict, we will, treat no victors and no vanquished, and so we want to learn the truth through this TLC commission, but we will not punish people who come forward with the truth. The truth helps us to heal as a country. Yeah, so this was the model of transitional justice. Well, Ubuntu, Africans' contribution to the world. All of a sudden, nobody talks about ICC, African dictators. We're going to show Africans how to solve their conflicts, right? And so the ICC, sorry, the AU, is really at the in 2017, I think I start my book that way by saying that the AU was on the brink of withdrawing, a mass withdrawal of all member states from the Rome Statute, which governs the treaty of the ICC. And what was their beef? that the ICC was only coming after African leaders on the one hand, for conflicts. Two, that the ICC was also coming after very prominent, leaders. When it came for Omar Bashir of the Sudan, the Africans complained because they said he was a sitting leader, and it's not so much that they didn't agree that his leadership was problematic, but he was a sitting leader, and the clause gave sitting leaders immunity. And yet, the ICC and the UN and the rest of the world sort of just ignored African pronouncements of that, right? And sort of dismissed, Africa as a place where ICC will, adjudicate its conflicts. That's one. Then two, it came for Uhuru Kenyatta, and Ruto as his vice president, in ways that, for election violence, which, could have been found true or not, I mean, we don't know, but how are you going to take leaders to the ICC who are governing their country? They had already won, these seats electorally, and yank them out and put them in the ICC for adjudication, especially when the Rome Statute also stipulated that the ICC would be the court of last resort, and that national, courts, should first prevail, So the Kenyan court could have set up, and it did eventually set up a commission and inquiry to resolve the election violence. It could have done that, but the ICC, the question was the ICC being political, and also was the ICC also overreaching into Africa and saying you had a very aggressive president of the ICC at that time. Was the ICC saying, yeah, Africa is up for grabs, Africa is the place where we're going to, go in. And so African leaders saw it as a new kind of colonialism, a neo-colonialism. All African leaders, sort of agreed, this is not right, this is not fair, and we're going to get together and we're going to mass withdraw. They did not. But one little thing that I found very interesting in that clause was that they provided a legal framework for African sovereign states. They said, African states to withdraw if they wanted to, right? Or to challenge ICC rules, and even if somebody like Bashir came to their countries, here is the law, the legal framework that you can use to make sure that he's not arrested. So this is a way again where Africans, were sort of using their newfound agency, collective agency to face, international issues. In this case, it was transitional justice or transnational justice, and make an impact. I think the biggest impact that they made, it's still ongoing, but they said, you know what, why we keep fighting with the ICC? And I think they got some accomplishments. Accomplishments was, they dropped Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta's case, even Gbagbo from the Ivory Coast, wasn't taken by ICC, it was ICJ, I think. It was ICC. It was ICC. Gbagbo was taken and actually incarcerated, and his accomplices were held in the ICC court for almost 10 years before, when the case came to fore, dismissed for lack of evidence, right? So it's another win for the African Union, who brought up, all these sort of biases. But I think the biggest win for the African Union is by noticing this and saying, you know what, we need to develop our own court. So this led to the expansion of crimes against humanity, against their citizens, that they would also now be able to adjudicate these cases themselves. Now, you could say, the ICC has had, sort of limited successes in prosecuting. Actually, I don't know of a international leader, that they have been able to prosecute. They have prosecuted successfully army leaders, military leaders, things like that. But an actual leader, they have not. But or former leaders, they have not. Charles Taylor was prosecuted by the ICJ, but the African Union, in collaboration with the Senegal, the African Hybrid Court, did prosecute Idris, what's his name again, from Chad?
The president of Chad, the former president of Chad.
Former. I always call him Debbie, but it's not Idris Debbie. It's let me get it.
Yeah, that is fine. Our audience can check it up in the book.
Yeah. They should check it out. But they successfully, prosecuted him for life imprisonment, through their court, and he died he served maybe about 5 years, but died recently in jail. But the African Union's court was successful in prosecuting, so in terms of African justice or African transnational justice, which the world usually dismisses. How can Africans are perpetrators of injustice, not solvers of injustice. The African court said, no, actually, these local courts, and national courts, maybe are better, suited to, serve justice because they're local, because they're contextual, and because they also use a value model, that Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, initiated for the world, which is, when it's justice that occurs, through civil wars, that you've got to think about sort of reconciling, a country and not, just criminalizing, leaders. You've got to think about the broader context. And so I think, it's still ongoing. This is not absolute success, anywhere near absolute success, for the Africans. But, these are the things that I wanted to bring out in the book, that at least they're ongoing. And this is, the African story around transnational justice.
Thank you for that clear explanation. So, in chapter 7, you focused on China, and you advanced the view of an emergent African policy of China. I mean, one of the criticism against African leaders with regards to China and engagement with China is the lack of concerted plan, common, policy towards China. On the other hand, China is always seen as having a very clear plan about its engagement with Africa. So, do African states, through the African Union, have a coordinated China policy? What is it, and how can we understand it?
Yeah, thank you. And then just before I delve into that question, the leader I was talking about, the Chadian leader is his name, Habre, his name of Chad, okay? Just wanted to get that out there. And so China in Africa. And so I think I titled the chapter China in Africa, Patron or client, is it patron
or partner?
Or partner or patron, right? And I was playing again, up until maybe very recently, the dominant Africa-China, discourse was, is China colonizing Africa or not, right? And my sort of premise point of entry was that it's wrong to think about this relationship as a one of colonization, right? Colonization is a separate, distinct concept in human history, and certainly African history and colonial, we shouldn't diminish colonialism, and colonialism's effect, after effect, you know, by describing the relationship between China and Africa as one of colonization. Does that mean that the China Africa relationship is one of equals? Of course not. It equals economically, right? Of course not. The China relationship in Africa, like China's relationship with a lot of the developing world, emerges as China economy grows in the world and it becomes, the China becomes, an economic superpower, right? And a power in itself where it wants to make, economic relationships with world regions and actors that benefit China, of course, right? So how does it come into Africa? Africa with all its resources, right? How does it come to displace, the relationship, economic relationships that Africa has with, usually its former colonial powers. So Africa's biggest, economic partners in Europe as a region, or bilaterally with UK and France, mostly, to a lesser extent, other European economies, Portugal, for the Portuguese-speaking Africans, and the US, of course, on the other hand. And so what is there, and then the international sort of community and the international, sort of normative way to engage Africa is, through, liberalism, but it is a sort of patronizing, economic relationship where, we'll buy your resources, your economic resources. Sometimes we'll, sort of grab them and shortchange them through, it was never, we will give you aid, or even if it's aid for trade, we'll give you resources if you do this, this, and this, and this, and that, right? European and US, economic relations with Africa was always contingent on Africa remaining compliant, to those nations. That's just a fact. And so China comes in and says, hey, Africans, let's revive our historic solidarities during the Cold War, by the way. Remember, when, many of you were actually very non-aligned and wanted to, sort of move away from, Western control, and so many of us forged, militant alliances, through your communist regimes, and your socialist regimes in the past. Let's revive those ties on the one hand, through sort of a new model of Western disengagement, be like me, says China, which is non-aligned, but China first, and that's how to do it, just be neutral in global politics and think about, building your economies. So that kind of narrative and ideology works for a lot of Africans, states and leaders. But it's also the only contingent that China had was in its economic relations with Africans was the China first, you don't support Taiwan. But otherwise, I don't need you to be a democracy. I don't need you to embark upon human rights. I'm not looking at all that. I'll be very transactional with my resources. I will give you the resources, monies through my Belt and Road initiatives and other initiatives, especially help you build infrastructure. And that's another thing that many Africans see in development that the Western development industry had moved away from. The Western development industry was moving into supporting gender issues and all sorts of sort of soft issues when Africans felt that they really needed the resources to build, continue to build their infrastructure. Africa is very underdeveloped, a simple railway, a simple airport, a simple, massive roads through, the continent, buildings, these are things that they wanted built, and they wanted resources for. And China was a willing giver because China was also a developing world country, and China understood, that these are the things that needed to be built in Africa too. So the African states, absolutely were very, endeared to a China relationship, to the, behest, of the West. I just remember Hillary Clinton, who, used to come as a Secretary of State and, wag her finger at, I think it was the Zambian leader at the time, saying China will colonize you, go, and even the Zambians, sort of just laughing at her and not their leader. However, having said that, there were issues, right? So China, would enter into these transactions with African governments. And what I'm trying to say is that they were asymmetrical. They reflected the power of Chinese interests. Now Chinese interests, not colonial, but Chinese interests were just making sure that China got the better deal, and China, being a much more powerful country, it's not so much that China will invade you if you don't agree, but it's you want to make the deal, right? And so African countries, sort of agreeing to deals like, for example, China will say to Zambia, I'll build this airport, but all the builders will have to be Chinese. I'll have to, send my Chinese laborers, right? And then Africans, on the ground in Zambia saying, that displaces our ability to, build, and be engaged in construction, it takes away our labor, right? That's not a good deal, and so some African governments says, yeah, I know it's not a good deal, but we're taking it anyway because it's the only way we can get this done. And then the effects of that being, reflected in opposition movements in certain African countries like Zambia, for example, who, the Pose built their opposition on Chinese investments. So it's for the African Union through its platform called FOCAC, the Forum for China and African Cooperation, and, to consolidate all these issues around the continent, around the China and Africa, engagement. And it was actually Paul Kagame of Rwanda who, was the most, I think, active, and brilliant in forging, making sure that the African Union, sort of addressed, these, sort of challenges with the China-Africa relationship, to make sure that Africa positioned itself more forcefully, as a partner with China rather than China being, sort of patron for Africa, right? So the African foreign policy, I think I have a subsection that I call an emerging foreign policy. That document that I one of the summits, the FOCAC summits, actually forged a document called the Emerging Africa China policy, right? And it outlined, many of these goals and aspirations around more balance and, equal partnership around the relationship.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So a follow-up to that question is the difference between Western partners and China as a partner of Africa. In the book, you highlighted the shift from China's non-interference clause. Now it's becoming more embedded in African security, development. Secondly, China is always presented as a partner that fix no condition in its relations with Africa, which is, I mean, a lot of the Western countries are blasted because of its conditionalities when dealing with Africa. One question with regards to that is the clause, which I consider as a condition as well, one China policy, which is embedded in all its agreements with Africa. So for that, a lot of scholars contend the non-conditional clause when in regards to China. Another thing you also highlighted in the book is the preference for bilateral arrangement with African states, which also informed this move towards an AU concerted, policy towards China. In all of this, highlighting all of these, and also the asymmetry in trade, in migration flow, the access a lot of Chinese people have to Africa compared to what Africans have to China. How, like, when I look at it in practical, I try to understand the difference between China and the Western partners in dealing with Africa.
Well, let's say, well, how is it similar?
How it diverges actually,
I
what
know, but let me try to answer that by saying how it is similar first.
okay.
And similarity being that China, like the US, and several of the EU countries, are economic superpowers. That comes with, political clout. It comes with, economic clout. It comes with diplomatic clout. It's structurally, important in understanding the relationship, right? The fact that I use constructivism to, tell my IR story doesn't mean that, I don't acknowledge that realism,
Yeah.
realpolitik is the nature of international politics as well. And so far, that structure of, economic power, is going to also structure the relationship, with Africa, like the US, and the EU. So that's the similarity. But there still is a difference. So let's start with the non-conditionality clause. Okay. So yeah, China's non-conditionality clause is just one China policy. It does that even to the US. I won't talk to you or I'll talk to you, but don't embarrass me. I think the other day, Ching was criticizing, I don't know if it was an American or European Union, a very high actor who the China's premier said embarrassed China by deviating from China's a pronouncement on China's one China policy, right? That person knows that China has a one China policy, and that person, from this high, level country, deviated from that, and so that, as far as China was concerned, shut down any further negotiations. So the one China policy is not just for Africa. However, so yes, it has that, but its conditionality is not you have to be a democracy, you have to respect human rights, you have to restructure your economy, and your economy has to be in the lines of what we envision of ourselves. Those are conditionalities that are invasive and structurally can be structurally disruptive, for Africans to implement. That's why they don't usually implement them. They accept them, but they don't usually implement them. But China doesn't, ask for those kinds of conditionalities. And that's what I think is significant. Now, on the one hand, on the human rights and democracy, that's not a good thing. We do want, African countries to be democratic and respect human rights. But, China is not a democracy either, right? And so it also sort of recognizes, and China says, I don't even want to be a democracy. I mean, our system of government is fine in terms of their standards and is producing a lot of wealth anyway. So, so that also, is a factor. The fact that, China doesn't impose those kinds of policies on Africans is important. But I do think that, the terms of trade you're talking about in terms of how is that different from Africans. China says, look, I want your resource, so I want to buy your copper, for example, and I can give you cash, I can give you extra, loans, or we can do a transaction for upfront with the terms of exchange, right? So the win-win for both China and the African negotiating partner is goals. Both are free partners in global trade. There's no coercion, involved. So I think it is different, right? And I think that's why African countries have sort of
different
shifted from a lot of European and US sort of resources, including aid, to China because it's more flexible. But doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that it's not asymmetrical. I think I use the word asymmetrical. So the power of China is going to be reflected in these negotiations. And if you do a study across the continent, China's ability to go into a very small, weak state like Zambia is different from its ability and engagement with Nigeria, for example, right? The stronger state, like Nigeria, negotiates its terms with more equity, right? The weaker state, which has little capacity, has also little capacity to engage and negotiate. Again, that is why the African Union, remember that's really what the story is here, is the African Union's intervention is to equalize that and say, no, we don't want China to treat Zambia differently from Nigeria. We want to present an African standard, so that China, treats, Africans equally, to benefit the continent. That's hard, but at least, that's the, reference point.
Thank you so much. So we will be concluding. I have 3 questions. You can speak to them like one, we can speak to them collectively. and it's about the book's argument. What is the strongest evidence of Africa not being a subject of global politics, but um, a shaper of it? That is, the argument is that Africa is no longer just a subject of global politics, but a shaper of it. What is the strongest evidence for that claim today? That is one. The second one is about the book being a sort of about Africa's international relations theory. I was thinking about what is the next in terms of theorizing African IR. And finally, how you would probably rewrite this book and update it. It was written in 2022, and I would, if you could highlight any changes you could make as a result of the development 3 years after you've written this book.
Can you just repeat the second question?
Okay.
IR theory?
Yeah. So the second question is about the book being a book on African international relations, contribution of African international relations. So I want to know what would be next. Are we moving toward a full distinct African school of IR?
Okay, got it. Okay, so first question about evidence that Africa is moving away from victimhood and subjectivity, but becoming an agent and a global actor and player, so to speak. I think what is some direct evidence, I think, I mentioned it before in this interview, the fact that the African Union, next to the EU, are the only regional organizations that are full members of the G20 is a significant move.
Yeah.
Right? I think that the fact that the African Union, not the African Union, I'm sorry, African states, 2 African states, not Brazil, not India, not many other contenders for permanent residency of the UNCS, UNSC, but 2 African states have been promised permanent membership. That is as a result of African Union internationalism, right? Hasn't happened yet, but it's on the table, right? So those are two, strong factors. I think maybe a third might be Africa's counter narrative against the ICC. One might say, is that a good thing? Because the ICC has aspirational human rights goals, for the world, and those are, good for the world. But on the other hand, the challenge of international organizations and international liberalism being, sort of convened through, Western, sort of supremacy, goals, and therefore they're, sort of subjecting inequality of the world into global South, global North. To what extent, is Africa's challenge to this international organization, successful challenge, through the AU? I think, it's a success. Africans don't say they don't believe in human rights. They just believe in how are human rights administered globally and how is justice administered globally, and what is the contribution of the global South, especially in this case, Africa. So I think those are three, examples. Second one about IR theory and international relations. I don't think, I say that my book really sort of leverages Amitav Acharya's and Barry Buzan's fantastic book on the making of international, on the making of global international relations, and I think published in 2017 or 2018, or maybe 2019. But that's a sort of dominant emerging narrative for Amitav Acharya about global international relations. Who think you know that? Who would need global international relations? It's a contradiction in terms. International relations in itself should be international, but in the study of international relations, it's not. All we study is the international relations of the Western world, how the Western world has forged international relations, and much of what we read about in international relations is Western. And so Amitav Acharya comes in and says that is wrong. International relations needs to be global. It needs to include the contributions and literature and ongoing, practices of the whole world, Western and non-Western. And his sort of theory of global international relations is well referenced. But even though he used to be an Africanist, and has written, sort of a lot on Africa, I felt that book, had a nice chapter on Africa as well. But I just wanted to leverage it and sort of enhance it, and say, well, this is the African story. He did say in his book that he didn't think that, whereas he felt that there was a Chinese international relations school, an Asian international relations school, but there wasn't an African international relations school. There was just a sort of decentered sort of narratives around African agency and things like that. So I thought that was probably fair or not so fair. And I went back to, my readings of the Ibadan School of History, the Makerere School of History, and some of these, the history of Africa is the history of the world anyway, right? I went back to those readings and, sort of, thought about how they were theorizing about Africa in world history and how much of that, sort of also dovetailed the practice of African international relations. As this kind of regional international relations whereby, Africans were always sort of convened around this question of racial solidarity, just because of the nature of, transnational slavery, the slavery, colonialism, and the way the world was diasporized with Africans. And so now we've got the response. And the response is, the African international relations. There's a genre, there's a style, this thing I talked about in terms of we're also very hybrid, very much sort of connected to the Western world, but also sometimes resisting it. We have that complicated, that is, you can see that in, much of the practice of African global governance as well, right? And so that's the nascent theory that I would like to, advance, in future projects. So that's one thing that I need to the third question, that's one thing I want to advance, the theoretical elements, a little bit more, right? That there is a school of African international relations. But I also think I'd like to go further to speak to this African Union's positioning in the G20, the economic, arguments I'd like to, advance a little bit more deeper as well, and who knows where this African Union in the Security Council is going. I think I'd like to write more about that, as well. And then maybe to your own questions, of a fourth contribution, I think I'd like to extend is the division. So what about, African and international? What about, as long as Africa is still 55 separate
Yes.
nations, you know, um, how do how does African internationalism or multilateral governance work on the ground in Africa?
In Africa.
And that actually I am exploring in this ECOWAS. I'm exploring it through ECOWAS, not the whole union, but it raises, similar kinds of questions. You know, how does multilateral governance work really, in terms of the disparities between nations and regions and
Yeah.
the differences, in implementation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edozie, for joining me today. I am so honored to talk to you, and I feel so happy. I just want to highlight if there is any last thoughts you want to highlight about this book. Any last thoughts? If not, there's no problem.
Oh, as I even prepared for the interview, and thank you so much, Nomeh Kanayo, for what is a really, wonderful interview. I mean, we as scholars, I had to go back and reread my book because, as you said, I wrote it in 2022. It was published first and then republished in 2024. And so I went back and reread my own book, and I did find it quite interesting. Interesting myself, but also, some of the questions helped me also probe, some of the great questions that you have asked. So this has been a fantastic conversation for me. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof.